Welcome back. You're watching Insight. In today's edition, we are focusing on US elections. Right, so in our final segment, who will be good for India when we talk about presidential candidates, whosoever gets the nomination? Coming back to you, Mr. Goel, it's important to talk about India and Indian interests also, and which candidate and which party actually has the potential to safeguard Indian interests in the United States.
I really wish that this segment had started from that end, but since you have come to me, let me put it this way. I think we have come to a stage when we are not looking at the relationship with USA in terms of a Republican president or a Democratic president. There is a far greater content to our relationship, and there is a far greater element of the mutual dependence and interest, which actually takes it away to a more bipartisan level, where whoever comes will have their interest. As you have noticed, that Trump, after talking about the H-1B visas for the Indians, he has retracted and he values the relationship with India. Hillary Clinton, as a person who has been the state secretary, as having been the first lady, she has seen the relationship between India and the USA rise to the current level when it is acquiring, we call it strategic partnership, but it is truly becoming a strategic relationship now. So I think eventually, if you look at the regional situation, South China Seas, Indo-Pacific, etc., there is a huge deal of commonality where the interests between India and the US overlap. Strategically, economically, I mean, the list is too huge to go into details at the moment. So I'm not even going to look at really Republican versus Democrats at this stage for the either way we look, I think India will need to carry on what we have achieved so far in the relationship, and I'm quite confident that both of them will equally value the relationship between
India has shared a very cordial relation with United States in the last few years, and especially in the last 2 years, the sort of response it has received from President Barack Obama, and the fact that Prime Minister Modi is likely to visit United States in a few months from now on. What's your assessment, and how important whosoever comes as President of the United States, what sort of relations India can actually expect?
I think the big question will be which way the next president will take the United States in terms of isolationism vis-a-vis interventionism. Obama has tried to be somewhere in between these two extremes. Many people argue that he is basically inward oriented and he's basically a kind of a social welfare president.
Right.
He's mostly interested in Medicare and immigrants and creating opportunities for minorities and those kinds. So it's mostly like a New Deal of Lyndon Johnson kind of thing, but in a 21st century. So the argument has been that he's not been as forceful in projecting power and doing stuff around the world, and he's withdrawn. So I think if Clinton comes, my view is that she'll be much more engaged and will try to use levers of force, especially vis-a-vis China, because Obama is of course the author of the pivot or the rebalancing strategy, but in reality it's not been fully implemented. They've never managed to push all their naval assets 60% to Asia Pacific as they had envisaged. They're still stuck in the Middle East and other parts of the world. So I think Clinton, continuity meaning I think she'll also fast forward some of these things. So the logic of containing China probably will take more prominence from 2017 than is the case, because Obama has tried to hedge his bets. On the other hand, interestingly, Trump is actually pretty isolationist himself.
Right. And
if you see his policies, the sum of it, if you want to make a method out of the madness, if there is one, you find that he's largely arguing also that the old conservative mainstream republicanism, which is based on projecting military force, building military bases and all that, is useless and it's bunkum.
But our relations with the United States will also be defined much with the way US shares its equations with Pakistan, because in the last 2-3 years, the way things have shaped up.
Well, on that point, Republicans, Democrats hardly matters, right? Because for them, it's always been, and at the most Indian nationalists, we all believe that at the end of the day, the Americans, although they don't say it, they still want to keep India under check to some extent. If you see the overall the effect of their policies in the region, even though they have the China containment, on the other hand, they have never completely given up this Pakistan card. And to some extent they play it in Afghanistan. They have not been, even Obama administration has not been very keen on involving us there from time to time. So it clearly means that, as India rises, they will be wary of us too. But right now, it is still a confluence.
And the Afghanistan
of interest.
factor is very much intact, withdrawal of troops and the way, what sort of political stability we are looking at in Afghanistan. And China is also mediating talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban, and there are several issues also. But what sort of equations are you expecting, and whosoever comes as the president, how important it will be for India?
I look at the issue totally differently. I don't want to analyze Indo-US relationship in the global foreign policy context of the United States. I think the following things are going to be important in shaping Indo-US relationship in coming years. Number one, the economic situation in the world. Number two, India's performance in economy. Number three, India's economic policy. How much we are going to open up, how much the American business and traders can expect in doing business in India. This is going to matter more. If you see from the other side, the US truly wants to contain China. India wants the same thing but doesn't want to talk about it. The US wants to engage Pakistan, doesn't want to isolate a Muslim country with nuclear weapons. It wants to engage Pakistan. Number three, the US wants to fight terrorism. India wants to fight terrorism more than the United States because we are a bigger victim. We have been consistently victimized by terrorism for decades, the US since 9/11. So these are the critical issues, whether we can play ball together or we cannot. There will be hiccups, but there will be engagement. The engagement will depend on India's determination to play a certain role that the US expects India to play, whether in Indo-Pacific or whether in South China Sea. The US wants India to play a certain role. We are hesitant whether this government, which will continue, after the regime change, if I can say so,
2019,
how this government is going to, approach that policy will determine the shape and nature of Indo-US relations.
Okay, so largely you are saying that it will be the economic policy and the economic clout of India that will decide what sort of relations India will share with the United States in coming years. Yes.
Just very briefly, I didn't want to say this, but I think you have made a very good analysis of what actually we can expect in future. I just want to make one small remark. I don't think India wants to contain China. It's beyond our capacity to contain China, and we have no desire to contain China. We want to engage with China, but not on the US turf, not on the basis of what US interests are. We have our very, very strong interests, and there are the security issues. We have the boundary issue. We have the economic and trade issues, and those can be resolved only by engagement.
And also double standards on terrorism.
Double
standards on terrorism can't really work. Quickly.
Mr. Goyal was secretary in Ministry of External Affairs. I'm an academic. As an academic, most of the citizens in the heart of hearts will want India to be bigger than China, better than China, contain China. But as an officer, a former officer, whatever he said is correct.
So he is being extremely cautious. Mr. Narayan, in terms of foreign policy and India's expectations from the US presidency, how important, whosoever comes as the president of the United States will be for us?
As an Indian, it doesn't really bother me whether it's going to be a Republican or a Democrat who's going to be the president of the United States. We need to get rid of our timidity in foreign policy. We always punch below our weight in global policy. That has changed over a period of time. And India today is not what it was 25 years ago. We are a $2 trillion economy. The Americans want the trade to be $500 billion a year. You have 3 million Indians holding some of the most important jobs. Nobody can hope to become a president of the United States without getting donations from the Indian community. And as Winston Churchill said, the Americans always do the right thing after exhausting all other possibilities. So Mr. Trump sitting in the White House doesn't bother me because there is a State Department that everybody says, hello, you've been talking rubbish, don't do this. This is in our national interest. The electoral rhetoric is very different from actual thing when you sit in the White House and
when you sit in the White House and then you have to deliver on policies. It is a big challenge. Final comments on the program, and I'll start with you, Mr. Narayan, again. In terms of Prime Minister Modi's approach towards the United States and the way things have gone ahead in terms of our relations with the United States, we've also signed a logistics agreement with the United States, the latest, the strategic deal. US has a similar agreement with other 80 countries also. But how Prime Minister Modi's focus has been on other nations, its neighborhood policy, US also, and the expected visit of Prime Minister Modi to United States in the next few months, what should we expect?
Well, he's going in June, and for the last bilateral visit while Obama is in office.
Right.
4 visits in 2 years plus, it never happened in the history of Indo-US relations.
Right.
As someone who has been following Indian foreign policy for decades, the way Mr. Modi, who was a greenhorn international affairs, he was a small town boy from Gujarat, a chief minister. He didn't know anything about how foreign policy is conducted, but the way he has been going about it, I must say it's remarkable. So, it feels good that somebody is stretching muscles,
Right.
India's ambitions, is reaching out and things like that. And he went to Saudi Arabia, he went to UAE, now he's planning to go to Iran. Everybody thought that he's playing the game. No, I think there is a lot of thinking going on in the way we are conducting our foreign policy. So, whether it is Hillary or Trump, Indians should not worry, because today what we are, we reached a place where nobody can ignore us.
Right.
And forget about containing China. Nobody can contain China.
No one can contain China, but our approach towards US, we are very clear about US, our approach towards United States and the way our foreign policy will be conducted in the next few years. Prime Minister Modi's approach, and what should we expect from the next visit which is happening in June?
Prime Minister Modi springs surprises all the time. Last time he was in the United States, a joint statement was issued, and the title of the joint statement was Chale Saath Saath. I think this time, this is my prediction. I hope he is not listening to me.
Right.
If Modi goes to Washington DC in June and somehow he manages to at least shake hand with the 2 candidates, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, I think that can make Chale Saath Saath more effective in times to come.
Okay. Final comments from you, Professor Cholia. What should we really expect from Prime Minister Modi's visit?
Well, I think he is going to visit a very fragmented America, which is so divided now and polarized, and he's going to see a body politic that is struggling to come up with a new administration. And so I think in policy direction terms, it's probably too late, because Obama administration is now a lame duck situation. But nonetheless, I think the work that's been done last 7-8 years, and especially last couple of years under Prime Minister Modi, is remarkable, and especially in the defense sector.
Right.
So economic relations anyway has been booming, but what the defense cooperation shows that greater degree of strategic trust is coming. But we still have problems with the Americans, and my fear is that from 2017 onwards, the Americans will whether it's Clinton, especially Clinton, she's going to be more assertive, and we will need to maneuver our way to capitalize on that, without caving into the American agenda for the region, because at the end of the day we want to be our own great power.
Right, and that will ask for greater economic clout. Final comments quickly.
Very, very briefly, it's very unusual for a president of the USA to organize a state visit for another head of government in the last year of his presidency. So I can only speculate that there must be a good reason for the visit to have been announced and organized.
Right, and that's
I will just leave it there.
That's from the former secretary of MEA. Thanks very much, all of you, for joining us in this program. Pleasure having all of you here, and that's all we have for you in this edition of Inside. Thanks very much for watching. Namaskar. Welcome back. You're watching Inside. In today's edition, we are focusing on US elections. So on the foreign policy front, what's the stand of key candidates and US and world in the second segment? Coming back to you, Mr. Goyal, on this, as far as US's relations with other countries are concerned, Pew Research Center did a survey, and it said that people who thought that America is a superpower, this figure actually was 38% in 2012. It went down to 28% in 2014. Sort of for a country that is used to be on top of the world, the last 15 years haven't been great in terms of foreign policy. They think that US has lost its stature. Do you agree with that?
It's a yes and no really. It's a very simplistic statement to say that USA has lost its stature.
Right.
What I would say is that since 2012 or since the time that USA, there were 38% people voting for USA as a superpower or recognizing, there are more countries which have come and joined the field.
Right.
China is actually baying at the heels really. It's coming fast forward. Now, therefore, there are many more countries who recognize that there is a contest between the USA and China to get that spot in the as the world number one position. They also recognize that despite all the efforts being made by China, China is not going to get the status of that kind of the USA as a superpower in the near times to come. But they also know that economically, today USA is much more dependent on China than it ever was in the past. Therefore, while as a military power, as a strategic power, USA may continue to have its say in global affairs, economically it is losing out. That is one.
Right.
The second thing, if you look at the foreign policy successes of USA in the last, say, let us say 5 years, how many can we count? I mean, Middle East is a mess. Obama himself said that Libya policy was a failure, despite everything. He has not been able to keep China out of the South China Seas. China, despite they signed the TPP, but China is gaining in stature in the Pacific. The nuclear issues continue to be as prominent as they were ever before. Pakistan, Afghanistan, you name it. He has gone to Saudi Arabia.
You're saying that as far as foreign policy approach is concerned, US has lost more in last few years than it has gained?
I think it's not a simple loss and gain analysis. But basically, USA does not have great successes to show on the foreign policy front over the last 5 years.
What's your take on Iran and Cuba? Because these two countries where US actually made a mark.
I don't think that I would really count them as success stories of the USA. Iran had to happen because the USA was getting disillusioned with Saudi Arabia in any case in the area, and with the oil prices falling, and I think it was a deliberate policy to bring Iran forward to get one of the sponsors, as they see, of ISIL counterbalance. Cuba, there are Cuban people living now in Miami, and they themselves had changed their position on Cuba. They were the ones who were opposing earlier opening of relations between USA and Cuba, and now they are advocating it.
It was a very cautious approach, but going by the Pew Research Center, again, 70% of Americans also think the US is losing respect internationally. Foreign policy approach, and at this stage when you're talking about US elections, key candidates and their approach, the way Donald Trump, if one has to say, his reactions on very critical of Japan, China and South Korea, and the way he has said that Beijing's currency manipulation is robbing Americans of jobs, rather a very simplistic observation there. How do you see the way candidates have approached, and because foreign policy, the first thing we say, it's largely about continuity. So are we going to see this happening in days to come?
Well, you see, if Hillary wins, she is going to be carry forward the mantle of Obama. But she's definitely more hawkish than Obama on some aspects. See, what has happened is the perception of decline is linked to Obama's hesitance to use military force. And he says, I'm not like a hammer looking out for a nail wherever it exists. So his doctrine has basically been to judiciously use military force, and there have been no major success. For example, they took out Osama bin Laden, and nobody can forget that. As Al-Qaeda has been decimated more or less. Of course, it doesn't mean that the problem is over. Now we have ISIS. So, and then I count Iran and Cuba as major, paradigm shifts in American foreign policy. But nonetheless, the perception of decline, which Trump is capitalizing by saying make America great again, is based on the notion that power is largely exertion of military might. And that has come because historically, prior to Obama, especially under the Bush Jr.,
military
force was the main way they were projecting power. So Obama has resorted more to, relatively speaking, more to diplomacy. And that is, I think you're right that it is simplistic. The notion of decline is simplistic. The figures don't bear out the fact that it's completely crashing down as Trump likes to project it. But I think there is interestingly an isolationist streak even in Donald Trump.
Right.
He's saying we let South Korea and Japan have nuclear weapons.
Right.
Why should we offer protection? You know,
Right.
the Europeans are like free riding on us and
Right.
so on. So what is interesting is that the Obama success, irrespective of the fact that Trump and Cruz are dead against Obama politically, have crept in the sense that.
But Professor Chawla,
there's
for a
no-
moment, if we actually think that he actually gets the Republican candidate nomination, the point is that when we're talking about foreign policy, is it just a matter of campaigning? Because there are many things that you say when you're campaigning, but the world is
For
actually very
example,
different, and it's difficult to
Exactly.
implement these things.
For example, 40% tariffs on Chinese imports. That will lead to WTO legislation,
Right.
which Trump is totally unaware of.
Right.
And the US will be like hammered with retaliatory tariffs, and American exports will completely nosedive. So these are mostly unrealistic. Making Mexico pay for the wall that he wants to build,
Right.
I mean, that's outlandish. The Mexicans are laughing about it.
Right.
So I think at the end of the day, if you see, Hillary is relatively speaking more rational. But I worry that there will be a shift nonetheless, because she's more hawkish and conservative on various issues. She wanted to bomb Syria after the so-called chemical weapons issue.
Right.
She was interested in full-on attack on Libya. She voted for the
And
unpopular
this
Bush
North Korea,
administration
South Korea.
invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Right.
So if you look at her record, it's not looking good. Because 2017 onwards, I fear that America will come back more forcefully in terms of military might, and that may actually grate on a lot of
But
nerves
when your
around the world.
economy is not doing very well and your people are blaming you for all these military aggressions, it's the American citizens who have paid so much. Can Hillary Clinton, if given the opportunity to be the first woman president of United States, can she really take that step? Because we are talking about foreign policy here. It's generally believed that it's the domestic issues, domestic policies, which decide the fate of who will actually be the president of the country, rather than actually the foreign policy.
Right. For a long time, election in the US, the election outcome was determined by the domestic politics.
Right.
But in this age of globalization and WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter, American people, like even Indian people, are becoming more and more aware of global affairs and how the US is so deeply engaged in the rest of the world, they cannot ignore anymore.
Right.
More particularly since 9/11 incident and the American commitment of troops in Afghanistan and ISIS and all that. So it is difficult to say that foreign policy doesn't have a role anymore. It is certainly domestic politics is going to dominate, but foreign policy is important. This is not the time to actually talk about Hillary versus Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a complete novice as
Right.
far as foreign policy is concerned. He doesn't know anything about foreign policy except maybe some trade issues and all. Hillary Clinton, a senator, a first lady at one time,
Right.
and a secretary of state,
Secretary of State.
she understands the world. She understands India. So whenever Hillary Clinton is talking about foreign policy, here is a lady who understands the world, and she will take necessary action to protect and promote American interest.
Right.
But Donald Trump right now is trying to play to the gallery. He's just, again, as I said, he's shooting his mouth on foreign policy issues, thinking that some Republican voters would really like him
Right.
because he's speaking his mind out, rather than talking like somebody, an established person in Washington DC, in a very sophisticated language, articulating American national security policy abroad.
When he talks of military aggression, as Professor Chawla just mentioned, sending out a strong signal that because is that really the right way to talk about building your stature, and US is losing its role and the whole status of a superpower? Is military aggression the right way?
Let me tell you, it is the Americans who are making the Chinese richer by more than $250 billion every year by buying Chinese goods, including the shoes and the toys and the clothes and whatnot. So although these big figures like China has become #1 manufacturer in the world, #1 trader in the world, #1 consumer of luxury goods, sounds very good
Right.
in debate. In reality, the US economy is still #1. In reality, it is the dollar which is worshipped around the world and not RMB. In reality, it is the US which dominates World Bank and IMF and WTO and not the Chinese.
Right.
So the US economy is still #1 in the world.
Okay.
And the US maintains 350 military bases in every part of the globe. China has just one little naval base in Africa,
Okay.
recently established.
Okay.
So no match.
Okay, no
comparison.
match. Research centers can say whatever they want to, but US, as far as US stature is concerned, no match. China, we can call China as a rising power vis-a-vis United States. United States has a policy towards Southeast Asia and South Asia of pivot to Asia. We will talk about that also and India's interests in India, how important it is for India to have a good president in the United States. But coming back to you, Mr. Venkat Narayan, on foreign policy and the way candidates have responded on this issue.
Well, you know, basically I think America is in a kind of state where the domestic issues are going to be more important than foreign policy. You know, George Bush used to say, bring them on. We want to play the global policeman and all that kind of thing. The world has changed a lot since then, you see. And it is absolutely true that America continues to be number one in terms of, you know, on any parameters. China or India or Russia, they can never hope to catch up for the next half a century. Never mind what intellectuals write, America is gone. This is, of course, this century will be Asia's century, and you know, 20 years from now, China and India will overtake America in terms of GDP and so on and so forth. That's a different matter. But nobody, you know, America is in no position. Nobody wants America to come and, you know, meddle in their domestic affairs.
Right.
In what they have done in Africa or even in the Middle East. You know. Why? How did Al Qaeda come up? Because they were backing the Saudi regime, which people saw as a dictatorial regime, you know, family rule and that kind of stuff. So, if Al Qaeda and ISIS have come up, it has a lot to do with the way the Americans were conducting their policies. You see.
The sort of tacit understanding between United States, also Saudi Arabia, and the funding for the rebels in Syria, it is all actually, you know, the whole plan laid out, even their actions in Pakistan, somehow backfired them in a big way. And then when you talk about foreign policy, the US's approach in the last few years?
Well, I think Obama tried to disentangle from these two major conflicts that he inherited from Bush.
Right.
But the rise of ISIS means that they're back in Iraq now.
Right.
More than 5,000 troops. And Afghanistan also, they are using more and more although they are supposed to be only advising and training, they are getting into combat again and again now because of the resurgence. So I think these problems will remain and will go into the next presidency. I mean, people like Trump can, you know, simplistically say we'll carpet bomb them to oblivion.
Right.
But it's not going to work, you know. The point is you need ground forces, you need local allies, you need to build coalitions, you need to also change the attitude of regional powers, which have played a negative role in many of these conflicts. Pakistan has completely, you know, sullied Obama's plans in Afghanistan.
Right.
Saudi is, you know, spoiling the show in Syria and Iraq. So therefore, you know, it needs actually a continuation of diplomacy and coalition building, which right now in the fray, if you look at it, only Hillary Clinton is capable of delivering.
Okay, only Hillary Clinton is capable of delivering, when all of us, in fact, none of us actually know that who will actually get the nomination from the Republican Party. But it's rather scary when you think of Donald Trump getting the nomination. As far as foreign policy is concerned.
Even in terms of foreign policy, you see, when a candidate, when Junior Bush went into the White House, people had as many doubts about his foreign policy approach as now they might have. Narendra Modi, when he became Prime Minister, he was not at all known as a foreign policy, and look what he has done in terms of foreign policy. There is a kind of a commonsensical approach which people do tend to adopt. As far as the details are concerned, there will be a huge number of advisors who will be able to brief him on the implications of any decisions they take. Of course, eventually he will take the decisions on based on his own instincts and what he thinks. So I don't think that he will cut such a poor figure really in terms of foreign policy. We may not like, it may not be exactly what we think he should be doing, but certainly he will not be sounding so amateurish as we think.
Okay, so amateurish or naive also as far as foreign policy is concerned. It's now time for me to take a short break, and next when we come back, on the other side in our final segment, we'll focus on India and what's at stake for India as far as US presidency is concerned. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Natasha Chabhaskar. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton has notched resounding victories in New York, moving significantly closer to their party's nominations. Their decisive win ushered in a new phase in the 2016 campaign. Both Trump and Clinton have fought bitterly for months to keep their rivals at bay. In today's edition, we'll be discussing all that's making headlines in US election campaigning and what's at stake. Joining me on the program today, very esteemed guest with me, senior journalist Venkat Narayan. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us in this program. Pro Vice Chancellor JNU, Chintamani Mahapatra. Thanks very much, Professor, for joining us here. With me, Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs, Professor Sriram Cholia. Thanks very much, Professor Cholia, for joining us here. And former diplomat Suresh Goyal. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us in this program. I'll start the program with you, Mr. Goyal, on the first segment on issues of what are the major issues between Trump and Hillary Clinton and the sort of response they got in their home state, New York. There are many who are asking what has really helped Donald Trump to seize the spotlight, headlines and votes at this stage. What has really worked for him?
It's going to be very, very difficult to make any reliable and I would say intelligent forecast on how the voters in the USA would vote in favor of one or the other really. In the past, very often those kind of estimates, assessments have been proven to be untrue, unreliable. But I guess that what has happened is that suddenly when Trump has come on the scene, he has come at a time when the American economy had been going down. Right. Blame was being apportioned to the international situation, particularly the immigrants, the visas for the Indians, professionals, Islamists really with the rise in the Islamic militancy. And suddenly Trump comes up with his rhetoric where he accuses actually all this of doing a great harm to the USA. He comes in calls the Mexican immigrants creating a wall between the two countries, etc., etc. And suddenly he's seen by as a savior by the people who are at the lower economic rung in the USA or basically who are looking for a hero.
So you're saying that he's got his fan following in the working class and the middle class, which is largely frustrated with the political mainstream. But at this point, Professor Cholia, if I can quickly bring you here, what is really working for Donald Trump and the sort of victory he got in New York, thankfully obliging both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton? But what has really worked for Donald Trump so far?
You know, essentially what's worked for him is the disrepute that the Republican Party has brought upon itself with its core constituency. They have seized both houses of Congress. They should have been in a position to have, the Republican establishment should have been in a position to promote a candidate who was widely acceptable. Right. But what has happened is essentially there is a kind of alienation towards the system, as it's called, where people are saying, the grassroots, especially less educated, lower skilled, working white Americans, men in particular, a lot of them are feeling like they are losing jobs because of trade agreements. A lot of them feel like there is a conspiracy of the Washington elites. Right. And Trump has come suddenly and positioned himself as an outsider who's going to clean up the system, as a big anti-establishment candidate. Right. And he's trying to capture all this protest and the anger that is simmering. But at the same time, he's also got this whole reality television background. So he has surprised a lot of people. I myself wrote him off 6 months ago saying that he's going to be out by now.
So you're saying he's capitalizing on the big American frustration. He's saying that if you are frustrated, I'm equally frustrated. And the whole talk of, though he's not a political mainstream
candidate. So he's like a protest candidate.
Right, he's a protest candidate.
Unfortunately for the Republicans, in November, if he gets through, he's going to be squarely beaten. But as far as the voters are concerned, it doesn't matter. They want to teach the Republican, the GOP, a lesson. And that's what they're doing.
They want to teach the GOP a lesson. But factors, reasons which, why the voters feel that at this stage the sort of response which Trump has received, what is really working for Trump, and bringing in the point on economy, because I have figures which say that the middle class and the working class over the past 15 years, there's a lot of public anger and disaffection in the United States. If one has to go for the economic output figures, it has rebounded and unemployment rates has fallen from 10% in 2009 to 5% in 2015. But the household incomes have generally remained stagnant for last 15 years. Is that the reason that they are going for not so mainstream candidates they're liking for Donald Trump?
2, 3 points. At the moment, it is not between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton.
Right, not yet.
It is only among the Republican members
Right.
who are nominating a particular candidate. Number one point is this, that the discredited Republican Party, they have been controlling Congress, but the kind of government is not working in Washington DC. Many times on small matters, the way they have been quarreling and the government is not able to work, that has really led people to think that these so-called conservative Republicans are not doing the job properly.
Right.
As far as the economy is concerned, the kind of figures you cited are correct, but most of the figures are actually government.
Right.
In reality, if you go through the other data, situation is much worse than what is reported in the newspapers. Slowly, the American middle class is getting wiped out.
Right.
Income inequality is rising by the day. And since 2008, the great recession that has hunted America, right now all these figures about little bit of growth is not actually doing the job. Huge number of people are unemployed, they are frustrated, and they want somebody to fix the economy. That is why Donald Trump, who is not talking conventionally,
Right.
he is shooting his mouth left, right, up, down. Many people think that he is not going to be supported by the Republican Party members, but the Aam Aadmi in the United States are really fascinated because here is a man who is speaking what they're feeling.
Is that the beauty of US elections? It has a long history of choosing unconventional and anti-establishment candidates. So what is new here?
What is new here is for the first time you are having a person who is not an establishment person. And in fact, unlike the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party, they don't have the concept of super delegates.
Right.
Otherwise, Donald Trump would have been thoroughly discarded a long time ago. Hillary Clinton has the support of 800 plus super delegates who are going to vote for her in the convention. But here in the Republican Party, the moment Donald Trump is able to get 1, 2, 3, 7, then nobody can beat him.
If I have to ask you to make a quick assessment of all the candidates, because of course we don't have the nomination as yet, but if one has to make the choices, Bernie Sanders, versus Hillary Clinton, how difficult it will be for him to bounce back now in the next primaries?
Bernie Sanders was doing pretty well. In last 6 consecutive primaries, Hillary Clinton lost.
Right.
But the fact remains that ultimately Bernie Sanders is going to be wiped out. Why? First, he is a socialist, self-admitted socialist, and the Americans are not going to take a socialist. Number 2, when he got married, his first honeymoon was in Moscow. He's the guy who went and met Fidel Castro. He's the one who went to Nicaragua and opposed the American policy in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas. So his supporters, some of his opponents said, this is now Sandinistas, those who are supporting him. So ultimately, Bernie Sanders is a good man. He's very articulate, very knowledgeable. He's pro-poor. But ultimately, it is money that
but
matters.
Isn't the US also fine-tuning its foreign policy, rebuilding relations with Cuba? So what's the big thing in that?
No. Now it is different. But the thing is, he's not an establishment person.
Okay.
He has lost many elections until after the end of the Cold War, he won the election to the House of Representatives.
Right.
He is not a time-tested leader of the Democratic Party.
Right.
He's an outsider to the party. So ultimately, Hillary Clinton, who is the support of these so-called super delegates, the hardcore members of the Republican Party, she will make it. In fact, I can predict that there is a possibility of the first woman president in the United States which is in the making.
Okay, and Trump versus other candidates, Rubio, at this stage, do you see a possibility for him to bounce back?
It is very difficult. Most likely after the New York vote, Donald Trump is slowly moving towards the direction where he might get 1, 2, 3, 7 delegates, and he will make it most likely because the gap between the number 1 and number 2 is huge. Right. Donald Trump is 44%, and here it is 33%. It's a big gap.
It's really getting murkier day by day and closer, tough. With each passing day, looks like the US presidential election is actually throwing a lot of surprises. What's your assessment, so far what we have seen?
Natasha, the reason why Trump is making waves is, as my friend says, he's been shooting his mouth off and keep the Muslims out of America, build a wall across Mexico, and don't let Indians and others come on, H-1B visas and so on and so forth. So the average white American, there is a certain amount of frustration across the board. Actually, they have not really reconciled to the fact that a half black, half white, like Barack Obama, is the president of the United States.
Okay.
So, and he is saying the kind of things which the average American or Aam Aadmi, to put it in simple language, is not happy. But we have to see whether, if it is going to be Hillary and versus Trump, whether Trump will make it or not. And if he makes it, I shudder to think what will be the fate.
Right, but the sort of reactions, on crucial issues, as you rightly pointed out, the sort of monitoring in mosques and all sort of brash statements made by him. What does this really suggest about the American society also, which is actually responding positively on all these remarks?
Yeah, you see, the thing is, the thing about America is that you have some of the finest educational institutions. You have Stanford, Harvard, and Berkeley, Columbia, you name it. But the average American is not terribly well informed, not highly educated, and he is only worried about his wages, whereas
Right.
the immigrants, like the Indians, the average Indian in America who is a graduate and has a degree from Harvard or wherever, he makes twice the amount of money the average American makes, you see.
Right.
And it is not the Indian's fault, but it is the American who has not been able to educate himself and compete with these people, you see. So it is people like that who are rooting for Donald Trump, you see.
Okay. So there's a high level of disillusionment within the American society, and Donald Trump is really at this stage, as far as his campaign is concerned, is cashing on that disillusionment. For him to say he wants to build a great wall between the US and Mexico, a mass deportation of the estimated 11 million illegal immigrants living in the US should go into effect. He and Vladimir Putin would get along very well. These sort of statements, we'll focus also on the foreign policy in the other segment. But my question is, why are Americans so angry? Why are they so angry?
Well, I mean, first of all, in any society, I think the people are affected not so much by highfalutin intelligentsia statements, the Harvard degrees and so on and so forth. They are really persuaded more by the day-to-day issues affecting their own lives in general. Now, when you see that the unemployment is growing, I mean, or it's stationary, but the incomes have not increased, when they say the lifestyles are not really improving, when you see that the average white worker, labor, is not really getting what they think is their due, they are going to be angry with the system somewhere, and they are going to find a solution somewhere, and they find that somebody who can actually talk the language of addressing those ills by throwing the immigrants out, he becomes the hero for them. Right. Whether he does it ultimately or not is a different matter altogether, but at least he's talking the language, he's addressing the core issues which actually frustrate the people in the USA. So I'm not at all surprised. But I think we must also understand that it's only the Republican Party. Hillary Clinton has not at all really talked about the issues of the immigrants in the manner that Trump does, and yet she goes across and she is getting a huge number of votes in the primaries, essentially on a different platform. And there the platform really is what Obama or what the Democrats have preached or Bush had done, a highly globalizing USA playing a global leadership role, which is another section which actually lacks it really. So therefore, I think there is a frustration at the same time that USA is not able to play the role that it should be playing, and also at the same time that the people are not really getting what they should be getting.
And in the new world order, where is US really placed in vis-a-vis other countries, be it China, Japan, and also the sort of the big pivot to Asia. We'll talk about US and world also, but talking about immigration, America's demographic is changing. Nearly 59 million immigrants have arrived in the United States since 1965. So immigration is a big issue, and Donald Trump has exploited this issue very well.
Yeah, but this goes both ways, because Ted Cruz, who's his nearest opponent, is partly Hispanic. And so Trump's, the populism, as it's called, the right-wing populism, has limits, because if you see Obama's Rainbow Coalition was mainly minorities, women, young people, as well as these immigrant communities, which voted largely for Obama twice, 2008, 2012. That coalition, Clinton has more or less inherited that group of voters, the demographics, if you see.
Right.
So she's way ahead. If you see the national electorate, you know, not these registered voters of each party. All the polls are showing, CBS, the New York Times, they're showing Clinton is ahead of Trump by 10-15% points, because, you know, the anti-immigrant rhetoric does not go beyond a certain racist constituency in the American society.
Right.
And America is diverse. There's also liberal section of
so which are really the important constituencies, you know, who are going to vote and will really work for Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton? Also women as a constituency, because the sort of remarks made by Donald Trump, how far the women constituency is going to vote, and in fact much will be decided once the nominations are done. Time now for me to slip into a short break. Next, when we come back, on the other side we'll focus on US and its changing relations with other countries, and how as far as this election is concerned, will that have an impact on its changing relations with other countries? Stay tuned.